I was awoken Tuesday morning by a call from Carl. I'd been sleeping poorly, my dreams filled with the strange lady I had encountered on my rounds that night. The more I studied her, the more I came to believe that she was the statue from the pond. But that was crazy. Statues didn't just get up and walk around on their own. The more I remembered about that night, though, the more convinced I became that it had been the woman depicted in that statue. Was she someone who worked at the park? Did we have an actor that portrayed her for meet and greets? I didn't know, and I realized that the only way to know would be to conduct more investigations. When the phone rang, I'd been drifting in and out of sleep thinly, and I must have sounded groggy when I answered. "Hey, kiddo, you feeling any better?" I lied and told him I was feeling okay, and the answer seemed to make him glad. "That's what I was hoping to hear. I hate to do it to you, kid, but I may need you to cover night shift on an emergency basis for a little bit." Something happened to Chuck?" I asked, wiping the sleep from my eyes as I tried to focus. "Yeah, he disappeared. Showed up and the booth was empty. Chuck was a bachelor, though, so it's possible that he just got an itch and decided to leave. We can move the new guy to nights, too, if Randy says he's ready. By next week, I think, but until I can, I need your help in running the show 7 nights a week." I paused long enough for him to ask me if I was still there, weighing my options. Spending more time on the job would allow me to investigate the statue more, and I'd be lying if I said I couldn't use the money. I was still paying off student loans from the small loan I'd taken out to try for a degree in business, and my credit card situation was still looking a little dire. It would be rough working all those hours the next week and a half, but I had little doubt I could do it. "Kid, you there? I know it's a lot to ask, but..." "Yeah, no problem. That's time and a half after my regular 40, right?" "Given the circumstances, let's say triple time. Doc Thurston's taken a liking to you, and says it's the least we can do after you collapsed at work." We chatted a little bit more, and when I hung up, I went to the cabinet and crunched up a couple of melatonin that were slightly out of date. I would need some solid sleep before tonight, it appeared. April 2nd. I was about 2 blocks from the park when I saw the new signs by the side of the road. "Come see the new Trees of Georgia exhibit at Cashmere Botanical Gardens." The signs featured pictures of native trees, their names little more than squibs below them. I had to squint as I rolled past them, not sure what I'd seen. The trees looked like they had little cameras on them or something. It was weird, but I suppose that someone would explain it when I got to work. The banners on the outside of the park told me that indeed, our botanical garden was running a display, and I could see flyers and pamphlets on the Welcome Center rack explaining the exhibit. Randy, however, turned out to be better than any flyer. "Look who's back," he said, shaking my hand. "You had me scared there for a minute. Glad you didn't just run off, given the circumstances." He looked a little down, and I told him I was sorry to hear about Chuck. Randy and Chuck had started out on the same shift, and their off days matched up enough for them to maintain a consistent friendship. They had been buddies for quite a while, and Randy was taking the news of his friend leaving pretty hard. "I just wish he'd call me or something," Randy said, looking glum. "I got one call from him before he disappeared, but he must have just butt-dialed me or something. It was weird, too. It was in the middle of the night, and all I could hear was some old sciencey guy talking about trees." "Trees?" I asked, interested. "Yeah, talk about age and size and region and whatnot. He must have butt-dialed me by the new exhibit. Maybe he was gonna tell me he was dipping out, but kinda freaked me out a little bit." "Oh yeah, what is this new exhibit? Something about local trees or something?" "Nothing gets past you, kid," Randy said sarcastically. "Yeah, we got some grant money last minute and had to spend it on an educational exhibit. Talks about something from the state. Hence, Trees of Georgia." "Which area are they in?" "Governor's Ring. I tell you, it's been school buses of snot-nosed kids for the last 2 days. I'll be glad to see it go, but it looks like it might be here to stay for a while." I nodded, making a mental note of the location for my rounds. The botanical garden had 8 different rings where the exhibits were kept. Think of it like a clock. The governor's ring was at the 12 o'clock position, with the Gerber's ring, the Sylvere ring, the Massley ring, the Tuckman ring, the Reese ring, the Georgia State College ring, and the Delaney ring, all around them. They were named for their sponsors, and each ring held a unique exhibit. Keeping with the round theme, there were also large walls that encircled the rings, and within were other small biomes for permanent rings. The Pale Lady's Lily Pond was one such thing, and altogether it made up about 40 unique displays and set pieces to explore. It's been a real headache keeping all them kids from climbing the exhibits, especially with my new helper asking a string of questions while I do all the work. The noise from them trees is enough to drive an ice pick in your brain, too. Noise? I asked, unsure what he was talking about. I won't spoil the surprise. You'll see soon enough. It wasn't long before I realized what he was talking about. The governor's ring was towards the middle part of my round, and as I walked around, I heard the voices before I saw them. The signage proclaimed the governor's ring to be the home of Georgian trees. They had transplanted about 8 half-grown trees into the ring, and each of them had a little speaker box attached to them. The speaker box proclaimed the tree's name, in Latin and English, and some facts about it. It would have been cool if they'd been on a timer and not so close together. In the end, they all just kind of walked over each other, and the bleed over would definitely have given me a headache after a while. I'm an American birch, Fagus gratifolia. My bark is very smooth and light gray, remaining so as the tree ages. Large trees with rounded crowns and many long, Hi there, I'm American Yellowwood, Cladastrus kentuckea. I have a broad, round canopy and a vase-shaped, moderately dense silhouette. You can call me Tupelo, Nyssa sylvacanta. I'm also sometimes called black gum, and my summer leaves are a very dark color with a high gloss appearance. But the most spectacular part of me is my fall foliage, with many shades of yellow, orange, bright red, purple, or... and on and on and on. Standing there for only a few minutes was enough to make my temples throb, and I moved on as I continued my rounds. The adults I saw in the exhibit seemed to agree, though the kids seemed excited for some reason. Maybe it was the idea of talking trees, or maybe they liked all the chaos, but the ones I saw kept running around and trying to climb the trees. I ended up camping out in the ring for a while, telling kids not to climb the trees and asking parents to control their children. Thank God the garden closed at 7, because an hour later I was sweaty, tired, and nursing a throbbing headache as I started my second round. I had hoped that after the park closed the speakers might go off, but much like the muzak they pumped in over the speakers at night, I could hear the sound of the trees being described every round. I thought it was odd how well they carried, too. Sometimes it seemed like I could hear them, certain trees at least, while I was in my office, only to hear different ones later in the night. It must have been windy, too, because I seemed to catch leaves rustling against the cameras more than once. I mean, it's a botanical garden. Leaves are kind of everywhere, year-round. But they don't usually buffet against the cameras quite that much. It was 9 o'clock, my fourth round of the night, when I heard the weird science guy voice that Randy was talking about. I was coming around the third ring, on the east side of the garden, when I heard someone talking. I pulled out my mag light, thinking we might have an unscheduled guest. The third ring, Mastley ring, held a display of beautiful spring lilies and orchids, their arrangement looking like a meadow in full bloom. Mr. Mastley's groundskeeper had even set up a water feature so that it appeared that a stream was coursing through it, and it was pretty impressive to think about. There were 3 trees in the display, one of them holding a rope swing, and as I stood there sweeping my light, I could definitely hear the sound of someone talking. Rot resistant. Used getting burned. It was muffled, like someone was trying to keep their voice down, but I could still hear it. As I got closer, I finally picked it up, and it made me feel a little foolish for being so skittish. I'm a bald cypress, Taxidomius discontinuum. I am valued for my rot-resistant wood that is often used in caskets, cabinets, and boat building. I can be found in—" I switched the light off and kept walking. It was just some blowback from the tree exhibit. I made a note to talk to maintenance about maybe turning them down a little at night, as I made my way through the fourth ring, which was decorated in a lush jungle plant scene, and housed several very believable taxidermy animals from Mr. Silvier's personal collection. I'd been startled in the daytime by a few of them, and he had a couple of cats hanging out in there that would definitely have got him some jail time these days for even attempting to shoot at them. I heard a cacophony from the governor's ring as I came to the north end of the park, and sped up a little bit as the noise made my head start hurting again. I slowed a little, though, when I came to the pond that held the pale lady. She was standing placidly in the middle of her lily pond, fan still hiding her face coquettishly. She could be the twin of the woman I'd seen on the path, I realized, as I came a little closer. Whoever had carved her had done an amazing job. Her features were so clear, so defined, and there was none of the usual imperfections that you often saw from marble that was left out in the elements. She was free of dirt and bird splatter, free of moss or mold, and she stood like an alabaster angel in the— I jumped back as my shoe registered wetness. It appeared that while I was studying the statue, I hadn't been looking where I was going. I'd stepped right in the lily pond, and I cursed as I realized that my sock was going to be wet for the rest of the night. I tromped the remainder of my round quickly, shoe squishing with every step, and when I got back to my office, I took off the shoe and wrung my sock out as much as possible. I laid it out to dry across the corner of the desk, but as I was turning to inspect my shoe, I caught a huge something from the corner of my eye on one of the cameras. It was a blink-and-you'll-miss-it kind of moment, but whatever had moved in front of it had been enormous. It was the cameras over by the fourth ring, Silvier's ring, and it had blotted out the whole lens as it moved past. Well, not necessarily, I reflected. A bird or a bat flying in front of the camera could have achieved the same effect, but it had definitely given me pause as I sat there with my shoe in my hand. Without warning, the lens on another camera went dark for a split second. Then a third. It was harder to chalk it up to flying creatures after I watched it happen again and again. I sat watching the monitors as something large moved in front of the cameras. I suddenly didn't want to leave my booth. If it was something really big, then the concrete cubicle wouldn't offer me much protection. But it was like hiding under your blankets when you're a kid. You know it won't save you from the monsters, but it makes you feel better. I jumped when the alarm on my watch went off and told me that 45 minutes had passed. I realized it was time for another perimeter walk. I looked at the door the same way I looked at the closet door when I was a kid. Out there was where the monsters were, real or imaginary. If I went out there, it could get me. And that was when I had to remind myself that I was an adult. I had a job to do. I wasn't about to get fired because I'd seen a shadow and wet my pants. I put my shoe back on and walked out to start my round. I had barely come out of the booth when I started hearing the light sound of monotonous droning. I could hear voices coming from every direction, getting louder and closer. I refused to look behind me. I would not look behind me. I kept repeating it as the voices got closer. If I ignored them, maybe they would go away. It was just the wind anyway. The boxes were connected to the trees, for God's sakes. Trees don't move. My pace quickened as I rounded the third ring, but when my flashlight fell on the idyllic scene, I felt it slip out of my hand and tumble to the pavement. The bulb popped like corn in a pan, and I was left in semi-darkness. The spring scene had only 2 trees now, the poplar and the oak with the swing on it. The third one was gone. There had definitely been 3 trees there earlier. I remembered them. They'd been sitting symmetrically, and the scene had made sense with 3. But I remembered now that 3 was wrong. There had always been 2, at least before tonight. I cast my memory back to the month I'd been here and realized that was true. So where had the 3rd tree gone? "I'm your local chestnut oak." I spun in place as the shadow of the tree fell on me, stumbling back and tripping over the low fence of the exhibit. "I am a deciduous native tree that reaches 50 to 60 feet in height and has an equal spread when growing in the open." I had thought them half grown when I'd seen them, but even then they were larger than I was. The oak stood about 18 feet high and was broader through the middle than nearly 2 of me. The base, which had been wrapped in wet burlap sack, had burst as the tree's roots capered out like living legs. It was scooting towards me on those agile limbs, the wooden behemoth groaning as it lumbered along, and I raised my hands up over my head as I expected to be smashed into a red paste, when it simply rolled unseeingly over me. Even now, the strangeness of the situation was made all the stranger as the calm, educated voice of the chestnut oak continued to spit out facts about itself. It felt almost foolish that my last moment on Earth would be filled with descriptions of leaves and the possible width and breadth of this lush giant. When I wasn't immediately dealt with, however, I opened my eyes and saw the tree departing in a cloud of facts about temperature zones and blooming seasons. It was heading deeper into the garden, and I think even then I knew where it was going. I picked up my flashlight as soon as I could get my heart into something like a normal beat pattern, and headed after it. The light was useless, the bulb having burst, but I suppose that if I met any normal-sized attackers, I could always use it like a club. I think I wanted it out of some strange sense of security as well. The flashlight, the radio, the keys, they were all part of my uniform, and if I had them all, then nothing bad could happen to me, right? It's odd, the talismanic effect of our things sometimes. The tree wasn't hard to follow, but as I kept a safe distance behind it, I began to realize that it wasn't alone. The voices began to converge as we walked, and the oak was joined by a beech and a cypress, finally by the young black gum. This may sound comical somehow, a bunch of trees moving together on tentacles of living root, but it was all I could do to keep myself following them. The creaking of their legs, the groaning of wooden bodies not meant to move, the rustling of leaves as they fell in droves, and the yammer of the informational tapes that walked across each other in a hellish chorus was enough to leave my skin crawling and my brain ready to join it on a nice stroll away from here. I put my hands to my ears as we neared the destination, and when I saw the lily pond, my suspicions were confirmed. The 8 sturdy trees, others already present, stood around the small pond in a similar formation to the 8 rings of the Botanical Garden. All of them seemed to kneel as much as something without knees could kneel, and I watched as the huge moon seemed to put the statue in a spotlight as they bent before it. The marble figure held court over them, a delegation of trees come to plead their case before the pale lady. As I watched, the statue began to move. Dust began to fall from the arms. The fan slid away to reveal a face that grinned impishly. She looked two-faced from here, her features expertly chiseled into the marble, and as one side of her face twisted up in an infernal grin, the other pulled down in a rictus of a snarl. She thrust the fan above her head as the marble pattered around her, a woman freed from a basilisk spell, and when she opened her yellow eyes, I could feel her regard on me. I ran then, my shoes squeaking a little on the pavement as I took flight. I stumbled over the small wall and fell into a display of marigolds, but I kept running as I rolled free of them. I could still hear that hateful chorus, their facts now simply heralds of their gargantuan protectors, but they seemed to be getting further away. It didn't matter. I was glad they weren't chasing me, but My only concern was getting as far from them and that pale lady as possible. When I saw the guard shack coming up, I ran inside and pushed the door closed behind me, leaning against it as I panted like a dog. I was safe, but for how long? I went to the cameras looking for anything that could prove I wasn't just hallucinating. If I'd caught them on camera, I could show Randy in the morning and prove that this wasn't some practical joke. I could show it to Carl and Dr. Thurston. I could let them know what was happening after hours, and they'd be able to do something about it. The cameras looked so still and normal that it took me a few minutes to realize they were frozen. They had lost connection just as I stepped out from my circuit of the park, and I could see myself standing motionlessly as I crept from my hole like a scared mouse. I reset the system, but the data was lost, and the cameras stayed frozen for the rest of the night. I called Carl, the poor guy sounding like he was having an amazing sleep, and told him what had happened. He said it happened sometimes, and recommended that I press the network button when I remembered to, and be careful while I was on my rounds. Can't think of why anyone would want to break into a botanical garden, but if they do, the cameras won't be much help. I laughed. It wasn't something breaking in that I was worried about. It was the things that were already there. I skipped a few rounds that night. I'm not ashamed of it. I was too scared to risk going out again, and as the sun began to peek up over the horizon, the cameras suddenly snapped back to life. It was eerie how well it synced with 5 o'clock, and from my booth I could see that every tree was back where it was supposed to be in the governor's ring, and the pale lady was still on her little island out in the lily pond. I reported to this journal as Randy arrived for the day. I didn't bother submitting an actual report. Doesn't seem as if it goes anywhere anyway. I need proof if I'm to do anything about this. I need to find out just what the hell this is. You're still here. I thought you might be. Thanks for joining me for tonight's story. If your insatiable appetite for horror knows no bounds, might I suggest one of our playlists, or one of our previous stories in the archive? There should be one appearing at the end of the story any minute now. And of course, if you're not subscribed, why not go ahead and hit that subscribe button? Maybe hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of the spooky things that we do here. If you prefer your horror a little more analog, you can always pick up one of my books. There's a link below to my latest, and it'll take you to all the great things that I've posted on Amazon. For my book lovers in the audience, I always suggest coming on down to Patreon so you can become part of my ghostly reader tier and get a book anytime I write one, which is usually about twice a year. Speaking of my patrons, let's go ahead and thank them. Thanks to Janet for being our Spooky Skeleton tier contributor, and thanks to Hi Stacy, Winter, Xaronan, Emily Coltsfoot, Stephanie Carrington, Marianne Schuler, Tyler Parker, and Jennifer Damron for being our Ghostly Reader tier contributors. Thanks, everyone. We just couldn't do the show without you. If you're thinking you might like to become one of my patrons, follow the link below to my Patreon. And as always, however you support the show, I appreciate it. Till next time, Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.